So in the previous video, we talked a bit about soils and how we classify them and what affects the fertility of soils, and a little bit about soil nutrition. Now we're going to talk about soil nutrients in more detail, so how plants gain their nutrition from the soil, and also some of the symbioses between plants and other organisms that improve the efficiency with which plants take up nutrients. So a fundamental thing to think about is that this huge oak tree, for example, is much larger, has much greater mass than the acorn from which it grew. So where's all that mass come from? And you can think about this from the point of view of humans as well. So most of that mass comes from organic molecules made up from carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So in each case, we can think about where those things come from. Carbon comes from carbon dioxide, fixed from the atmosphere. Oxygen is also absorbed from the atmosphere by plants. And hydrogen is taken up by plants in the form of water. So it's kind of counterintuitive to think that all of that mass in a huge tree like this doesn't come from nutrients that have been taken up from the soil. It comes from air and water. So the essential nutrients needed by plants can be divided into macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients are the ones that are needed in high quantities, and we've already talked about carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen that make up the organic molecules that form most of the structure of plants. And beyond that, the most important macronutrients for plants are nitrogen and phosphorus, and we'll talk about those in a bit more detail. Beyond that, you have micronutrients. These are the ones that are needed in much lower quantities or trace amounts. So things like chlorine, iron, manganese, boron, zinc, copper and nickel. And then there are micronutrients that some plants need while others don't. So things like sodium, cobalt and silicon. Beyond micronutrients, you have beneficial elements. So these are nutrients that aren't essential for any plants, but they might stimulate growth. So probably the most important plant nutrient of all is nitrogen. And plants can absorb nitrogen through their roots when it's in the form of nitrates and ammonium. But most of the nitrogen that surrounds plants in the atmosphere is unavailable to those plants. So the only way plants can get hold of that nitrogen is if it's fixed into ammonium by bacteria. So some of those nitrogen-fixing bacteria are free living in soil, like those from the genus Anabaena. These are really important, for example, in fixing nitrogen in rice paddies. But plants also form symbioses with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, like legume plants form symbioses with rhizobium bacteria. And some other non-legume plants form symbioses with Frankia bacteria. So in legumes particularly, plants that form symbioses with rhizobium bacteria form these root structures called nodules. And so this is where most of those bacteria live and fix nitrogen for the plants. This is what an infected root nodule looks like. So this is a root nodule containing many bacterial cells. And this root cell on the right is a cell that's not infected with rhizobium bacteria. So the other really important mineral nutrient for plants in soils is phosphorus. And phosphorus is often the most limiting nutrient for plants. Different soils contain really different quantities of phosphorus. So limestone-based soils tend to be very high in phosphorus. Sandstone-based soils tend to be very low in phosphorus. But really, the amount of phosphorus that exists in the soil is not what's important for plants, because phosphorus is often unavailable to plants because it's very tightly bound to the substrate in forms that are not available for plants to absorb. So the vast majority of phosphorus taken up by plants is absorbed from the rhizosphere, and the rhizosphere is the area of soil literally within about a millimeter of surrounding root tissue. And these are kind of usually quite microbe-rich areas where the plants themselves can take action to change the availability of nutrients within the rhizosphere. So plants from the family Proteaceae do this by generating proteoid roots. So proteoid roots are these really kind of finely branched roots that you can see here. And first of all, this increases massively the surface area of the root tissue, but also these proteoid roots release organic acids, which actually kind of liberate phosphorus from what were previously insoluble complexes with calcium, iron, aluminium, and allow that phosphorus to be absorbed by the roots. So another way that plants increase their ability to take up phosphorus from the soil, particularly the rhizosphere, so the soil immediately surrounding root tips, is by forming symbioses with fungi called Mycorrhizae. So there's two major groups of Mycorrhizae: endomycorrhizae, endo meaning inside, so these are mycorrhizae that actually grow inside plant cells, and ectomycorrhizae, which are fungi which enter plant roots but don't actually ever enter individual cells, so they grow in the kind of intercellular spaces. Endomycorrhizae are grouped into three different types, so arbuscular mycorrhizae, sometimes known as vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae, and they branch into root tip cells and form these kind of clusters of fungal hyphae called arbuscles. Then you have ericoid endomycorrhizae that occur in the ericaceae, so things like heathers and blueberries, and then orchidaceous endomycorrhizae that occur in the orchids. And these are an interesting group because some orchids are actually completely dependent on mycorrhizae for seed germination and for growth. Ectomycorrhizae don't actually enter root cells, as I mentioned, but they grow in the intercellular spaces, and they often almost completely sheathe the root tip. So you might wonder what drives these symbioses generally. Well, the mycorrhizae produce enzymes and release them into the soil, and these enzymes release phosphorus that would otherwise remain tightly bound to organic matter in the soil and wouldn't be available to plants. And in return for this increased availability of phosphorus, the plants will provide the fungi with carbohydrates that they've produced through photosynthesis. So mycorrhizae also benefit the plants in a number of other ways. They can increase the availability of some other macro and micronutrients. They also provide a level of protection from some soil pests like nematodes and fungal pathogens. And in addition to that, they also provide connectivity between different plants, sometimes completely unrelated plants. So they're ecologically really interesting. They have a big influence on the competitive abilities of plants and the kinds of soils where different plants grow. And they're also relevant to things like restoration ecology. So if we have a site that's been cleared of all plants for years, if we try to reintroduce plants to that site, one thing that's going to affect that process is the mycorrhizae that exist in that soil. So maybe we'll have to inoculate that soil with different species of mycorrhizae if we want certain species of plants to grow in that area.